The morning started like any other Tuesday in Washington, D.C., but by noon it would become a day that changed everything. The marble halls of the Capitol building buzzed with activity as staff members hurried back and forth, carrying thick folders and whispering urgent messages into their phones. Something big was about to happen, and everyone could feel it in the air. Karoline Leavitt walked down the long corridor toward the hearing room, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks, knowing that today would test everything she had learned about politics and public service. The weight of responsibility sat heavy on her shoulders, but she carried herself with quiet confidence. 29 years old, she was younger than most people in these halls of power. Some saw this as a weakness, but she had always believed that fresh perspectives were exactly what Washington needed. Her background wasn't typical for someone in her position. She hadn't grown up in political families or attended elite schools, where future senators and representatives made their connections over expensive dinners. Instead, she had worked her way up through genuine hard work and determination. She understood what it meant to struggle, to worry about paying bills, and to wonder if your voice really mattered in the grand scheme of things. These experiences shaped her approach to every issue she faced, and they would prove crucial in the hours ahead. The hearing room was already packed when she arrived. Cameras lined the walls, their red lights blinking like watchful eyes. Reporters sat in neat rows, their notebooks ready and pens poised to capture every word. The public gallery was full of people who had taken time off work to witness what many expected to be a routine political proceeding. But routine was the last thing anyone would get today. Schiff was already at his position, shuffling through a stack of papers with the practiced ease of someone who had done this countless times before. At 64, he had been in Congress for over 2 decades. His gray hair was perfectly styled, his suit impeccably tailored, and his expression carried the confidence of a man who knew how to control a room. He had earned his reputation as one of the sharpest questioners in Congress. Many politicians had found themselves stumbling over their words when faced with his precise, methodical approach to interrogation. He had a way of making people feel small, of finding the exact pressure point that would cause them to crack under scrutiny. The contrast between the two figures couldn't have been more stark. On one side sat experience, establishment connections, and decades of political maneuvering. On the other sat youth, determination, and a different kind of preparation born from real-world struggles rather than political theory. The room gradually quieted as the hearing was called to order. The chairman's voice echoed through the space, explaining the day's proceedings to those watching both in person and through the live television broadcast that was being carried by multiple news networks. Millions of Americans were tuning in from their homes, offices, and phones. Some were genuinely interested in the political process, while others were simply curious to see what would happen when these two very different personalities clashed. Social media was already alive with predictions and commentary, most of it assuming that the outcome was predetermined. The early questions started simply enough. Basic policy positions, standard political talking points that any experienced politician could handle in their sleep. Leavitt answered them clearly and directly, showing that she had done her homework and understood the issues at hand. But those watching closely could sense that this was just a warm-up. Schiff's questions gradually became more pointed, more personal, and carried an undertone that suggested he viewed this as more than just a routine hearing. There was something in his manner that seemed to dismiss her before she had even fully answered his questions. The cameras captured every micro-expression, every slight pause, every moment of tension that passed between them. The producers in the control rooms of various news networks began to sense that they might have something more interesting than the standard political theater they had expected to broadcast. In living rooms across America, people began to pay closer attention. There was something about the dynamic that felt familiar to anyone who had ever been underestimated because of their age, their background, or their lack of connections. Many viewers found themselves silently rooting for the underdog, even if they weren't entirely sure why. The questions continued, each one designed to test not just knowledge but composure. Schiff's decades of experience showed in the way he phrased each inquiry, the way he built upon previous answers to create increasingly difficult situations. It was like watching a master chess player several moves ahead of his opponent, but something interesting was happening. While many expected Leavitt to become flustered or defensive, she remained remarkably calm. Her answers were thoughtful and measured. She didn't rush to fill silences or ramble nervously when faced with difficult questions. Instead, she took her time, considered her words carefully, and responded with the kind of authenticity that political consultants spend millions trying to manufacture. The audience in the room began to lean forward slightly. The journalists' pens moved more quickly across their notepads. The people watching at home put down their phones and focused more intently on their screens. What had started as what many assumed would be a predictable political confrontation was transforming into something more compelling. Two very different approaches to public service were on full display, and the contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. The tension in the room was building steadily, like pressure in a steam engine. Everyone could feel that something significant was about to happen, but no one could predict exactly what form it would take. The stage was set for a moment that would surprise everyone in that room and millions watching at home. As the questioning continued, it became clear that this wasn't just about policy differences or political positions. This was about two fundamentally different visions of how government should work and who should have a voice in shaping the future of the country. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of what was about to become one of the most talked about political moments of the year. The atmosphere in the hearing room shifted like storm clouds gathering before a thunderstorm. What had started as formal questioning was now taking on a different tone entirely. Adam Schiff leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he prepared his next line of inquiry. His years of experience had taught him exactly how to read a room, and he could sense that the audience was waiting for something dramatic to happen. The first hour had been relatively straightforward, but now the real test was beginning. Schiff's questions became sharper, more personal, and carried an edge that hadn't been there before. His voice took on the tone that had made him famous in political circles, the kind of questioning that could make seasoned politicians sweat under the bright lights. "Ms. Leavitt," he began, drawing out her name slightly as he looked down at his notes. "Your experience in government is quite limited compared to others who have held similar positions. How can the American people trust someone with so little background in the complexities of federal policy?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Everyone in the room understood what was really being asked. This wasn't about policy knowledge or qualifications. This was about establishing dominance, about putting a younger politician in what he perceived to be her proper place. Karoline felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her. The cameras zoomed in closer, capturing every micro-expression on her face. She could hear the faint scratching of pens on paper as reporters prepared to document her response. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few seconds. She answered calmly and thoroughly, explaining her background and the different kinds of experience that had prepared her for this role. But Schiff wasn't finished. His follow-up questions came quickly, each one designed to chip away at her credibility piece by piece. In newsrooms across the country, producers were getting excited. This was the kind of television that made for compelling viewing. The David versus Goliath narrative was practically writing itself, and early social media reactions were already starting to pour in. "She's getting destroyed up there," typed one viewer on a popular social platform. "This is painful to watch," wrote another. "Why? Did they put her in this position?" questioned a third. The comments section of the live stream was moving so fast that individual messages became a blur. Most viewers seemed to assume they knew how this story would end. The experienced politician would systematically dismantle the newcomer, and by tomorrow morning, it would be just another example of Washington politics as usual. But something interesting was happening to those who were paying close attention. While the questions were getting tougher and the tone more challenging, Karoline wasn't cracking. Her voice remained steady, her answers thoughtful, and her composure intact. She wasn't giving Schiff the reaction he seemed to be looking for. The third question in this more aggressive series focused on her voting record on a controversial issue. Schiff's research team had clearly done their homework, finding what they believed to be an inconsistency that would be difficult to explain. He presented the information with the precision of a prosecutor making a closing argument. "Can you explain to this committee and to the American people," he said, his voice rising slightly for emphasis, "how you can claim to represent working families when your own voting record suggests otherwise?" The accusation was clear, even if it wasn't stated directly. The implication was that she was a hypocrite, someone who said one thing but did another. It was the kind of charge that had ended political careers before, and everyone in the room knew it. The gallery was completely silent now. Even the reporters had stopped taking notes momentarily, waiting to see how she would handle this direct challenge to her integrity. The camera operators adjusted their positions to get the best possible shots of both participants. Karoline took a deep breath, not out of nervousness but to gather her thoughts. She had expected this line of attack and had spent considerable time preparing for it. But preparation was one thing. Actually facing it under these circumstances was something entirely different. Her response was detailed and factual, walking through the specific circumstances of each vote and explaining the reasoning behind her decisions. She spoke directly to the camera at times, addressing not just the committee but the millions of people watching at home who were trying to understand the complexities of the issues being discussed. But Schiff wasn't satisfied. His next question came even more quickly, and his tone had shifted again. There was now an unmistakable note of condescension in his voice, the kind that anyone who had ever been talked down to by someone in authority would recognize immediately. "Ms. Leavitt, with all due respect," he began, though his tone suggested very little respect was actually intended. "These explanations sound like the kind of political double-talk that the American people are tired of hearing. Can you give us a straight answer about where you really stand?" The insult was subtle but unmistakable. He was essentially calling her a typical politician who couldn't give a direct answer to a simple question. It was a masterful piece of political theater, designed to make her look evasive and untrustworthy. The audience reaction was immediate. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others leaned forward, sensing that something significant was happening. The tension in the room had reached a new level, and everyone could feel it. On social media, the reactions were becoming more intense. Political commentators were already writing their analysis pieces, most of them focusing on what they saw as a masterclass in political interrogation. The narrative was forming in real time. Experienced legislator schools, newcomer in the art of hardball politics. But something was wrong with that narrative, even if most people couldn't quite put their finger on what it was. Karoline wasn't behaving like someone who was being overwhelmed. Her body language remained confident, her voice steady, and her answers substantive. If anything, she seemed to be getting more composed as the questioning became more intense. The fourth aggressive question came with even less pretense of civility. Schiff was now openly challenging not just her positions but her right to hold them. His questions carried implications about her competence, her experience, and her fitness for the responsibilities she had been given. "Perhaps," he said, looking at her over his reading glasses in a way that reminded everyone of a disapproving teacher, "you would benefit from spending more time learning about these issues before presuming to make decisions that affect millions of Americans." The statement was devastating in its implications. He wasn't just questioning her knowledge. He was suggesting she had no business being in that room at all. The cameras caught everything, the slight tightening around Schiff's eyes as he delivered what he clearly thought was a knockout blow, the absolute stillness of the audience as they processed what they had just heard, and most importantly, the expression on Karoline's face as she absorbed the full impact of what had just been said to her. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, though they didn't know it yet. The setup was complete. The trap had been sprung, and now everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The stage was perfectly set for what was about to become one of the most memorable moments in recent political history. The silence that followed Schiff's final cutting remark was unlike anything anyone in that room had ever experienced. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of deep, profound silence that comes right before something changes forever. The air felt thick with anticipation, as if the entire room was holding its breath waiting for what would happen next. Karoline sat perfectly still in her chair, her hands folded calmly on the table in front of her. To those watching closely, she didn't look defeated or flustered. Instead, there was something in her expression that was hard to read, a kind of quiet intensity that suggested she was processing not just what had been said, but everything that had led to this moment. The cameras remained focused on her face, capturing every subtle shift in her expression. The producers in the control rooms were frantically whispering instructions to their camera operators, sensing that they might be witnessing something significant. This wasn't the reaction they had expected from someone who had just been publicly humiliated by one of Congress's most skilled interrogators. In living rooms across America, viewers were leaning closer to their screens. Something about the way she was sitting, the way she was looking directly ahead without flinching, suggested that this story wasn't over yet. The social media comments were still flowing, but they were starting to change in tone. "Wait, she doesn't look upset," typed one viewer. "Why is she just sitting there?" asked another. "Something's about to happen," predicted a third. The reporters in the room had stopped writing. Their pens hovered over their notepads as they watched this unexpected moment unfold. Some of the more experienced journalists were getting the same feeling they got when they sensed a breaking news story was about to explode. That electric feeling that comes when you realize you're witnessing something that will be talked about for years to come. Schiff himself seemed slightly puzzled by her reaction. He had delivered what should have been a devastating blow, the kind of public criticism that would normally send a less experienced politician scrambling to defend themselves or apologize. But Karoline wasn't doing either of those things. She was just sitting there thinking. The committee chairman looked back and forth between them, unsure whether to move on to the next question or wait for her to respond. The normal rhythm of these hearings had been completely disrupted, and no one seemed quite sure what the protocol was for this unusual situation. 5 seconds passed, then 10, then 15. The silence stretched on, becoming more powerful with each passing moment. It was as if time had slowed down, giving everyone in that room a chance to really think about what they had just witnessed and what it meant. Karoline's mind was working quickly, but not in panic. Instead, she was doing what she had always done when faced with a difficult situation. She was thinking it through completely before acting. This habit had served her well throughout her life, from her early days working multiple jobs to pay for college, through her first campaigns, and now in this moment that would define how she was perceived by millions of people. She thought about all the people who had supported her, who had believed in her when others didn't. She thought about the conversations she'd had with voters who felt like no one in Washington understood their struggles. She thought about the promises she had made and the reasons she had gotten into politics in the first place. But most importantly, she thought about what kind of precedent she wanted to set in this moment. Would she allow herself to be diminished by someone who seemed to believe that experience was more important than integrity? Would she accept the implication that her voice didn't matter simply because she was younger and newer to this world? The answer came to her with perfect clarity. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her head and looked directly at Adam Schiff. Not with anger or defensiveness, but with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you stand for. The camera caught the moment perfectly, the shift from contemplation to determination. The room seemed to sense that something was about to happen. The energy changed subtly but noticeably. People stopped fidgeting in their seats. The quiet conversations in the back of the room ceased entirely. Even the court reporters paused, their fingers hovering over their keyboards. Schiff was watching her carefully now, perhaps beginning to realize that her reaction wasn't what he had expected. His decades of experience had taught him to read people, and what he was seeing didn't match the typical response of someone who had just been publicly challenged in the way she had been. Karoline took a breath. Not a nervous breath, but the kind of deep, centering breath that athletes take before attempting something they've trained for their entire lives. She looked around the room once, taking in the faces of everyone who was watching. The cameras that were broadcasting this moment to millions of people, the reporters who were ready to capture whatever she said next. When she finally spoke, her First words were so quiet that people had to strain to hear them. But there was something in her tone that made everyone immediately pay attention. It wasn't the voice of someone who was backing down or making excuses. It was the voice of someone who was about to change the entire conversation. "Congressman Schiff," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I've been sitting here listening to your questions, and I have to say something." The pause that followed was electric. Everyone in the room could sense that whatever came next would be important. The social media comments were flying by so fast they were impossible to read. News producers were already preparing to cut into regular programming if this turned into something bigger. She looked directly into the camera that was focused on her, seeming to speak not just to the people in that room, but to everyone who was watching. Her posture was perfect, her expression clear and determined. "Before I respond to your last comment, I want everyone watching to understand something about what's happening here today." The words hung in the air like a challenge. This wasn't going to be a typical political response filled with talking points and careful language. This was going to be something different, something more honest and direct than what people were used to hearing from politicians. Schiff's expression began to change as he realized that the dynamic of the conversation was shifting. The confident smile that had been playing at the corners of his mouth faded, replaced by a look of uncertainty. He had clearly expected her to either crumble under pressure or launch into a defensive explanation of her record. Instead, she was doing something that caught him completely off guard. She was taking control of the moment. The anticipation in the room was now almost unbearable. Everyone could sense that whatever she said next would either make or break her political career and possibly change how people thought about politics itself. The stage was set for a moment that would be replayed countless times and remembered for years to come. What happened next would be replayed on news channels for weeks, shared millions of times on social media, and remembered as one of those rare moments when someone's entire career changed with a single sentence. But in that instant, before the words were spoken, nobody knew they were about to witness history in the making. Karoline looked directly at Congressman Schiff, her voice clear and steady. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming in the background. Every camera was focused on her face. Every reporter's pen was poised over their notepad, and millions of people watching at home had unconsciously leaned forward in their chairs. "Congressman," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone immediately pay attention. "You've spent the last hour trying to prove that I don't belong here because I'm young and because I haven't spent decades in Washington. But let me ask you something." She paused for just a moment, long enough for the weight of her words to sink in, but not long enough to lose the momentum she was building. The silence in the room was absolute. "When was the last time you had to choose between paying your rent or buying groceries? When was the last time you worried about whether you could afford to take your child to the doctor? When was the last time you worked 2 jobs just to make ends meet?" The questions hung in the air like thunderclaps. Each one landed with perfect precision, not just on Schiff but on everyone in that room who had grown comfortable with the way politics usually worked. The cameras captured the exact moment when his confident expression began to falter. "Because I have," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I've lived the life that most Americans are living right now. I've felt the fear of not knowing if I'll be able to pay my bills. I've made those impossible choices that millions of families make every single day." The impact was immediate and devastating. In a single moment, she had turned the entire conversation upside down. The experience he had been using as a weapon against her had just become her greatest strength. She wasn't just defending herself. She was exposing the fundamental disconnect between Washington politicians and the people they claimed to represent. Social media exploded instantly. The comment section went from thousands of messages to tens of thousands in a matter of seconds. News producers were frantically calling their anchors, telling them to break into regular programming. Political analysts who had been preparing to write about her political demise were suddenly scrambling to completely rewrite their stories. "Holy crap, did she just say that?" typed one viewer, echoing the thoughts of millions. "She's absolutely right," wrote another. "This is why we need people like her in office," added a third. But Karoline wasn't finished. She had Schiff's full attention now, and she wasn't going to waste the opportunity. The entire room seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what she would say next. "You want to talk about experience, Congressman? Let me tell you about my experience. I've experienced what it's like to work 3 jobs and still struggle to pay for college. I've experienced what it's like to choose between getting my car fixed or paying the electric bill. I've experienced what it's like to watch my friends and family worry about their future because the people making decisions about their lives have never walked in their shoes." Each word was delivered with perfect timing and absolute conviction. This wasn't a rehearsed political speech filled with empty talking points. This was raw truth, spoken by someone who had lived it and understood it in a way that most politicians never would. The effect on Schiff was visible to everyone watching. The man who had seemed so confident and in control just minutes earlier was now shifting uncomfortably in his seat. His decades of experience in handling difficult political moments had not prepared him for this kind of authentic, personal response. "And you know what, Congressman? That experience has taught me something that all your years in Washington apparently haven't. It's taught me that the people we serve aren't looking for politicians who can give the most polished answers or who know how to play the political game better than anyone else." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his face. The cameras caught every nuance of the moment, the intensity in her expression, the slight tremor in her voice that came, not from nervousness but from genuine passion. "They're looking for people who understand their struggles because we've lived them ourselves. They want representatives who remember what it's like to worry about money, to stress about the future, to wonder if their voice really matters in a system that seems designed to ignore them." The audience in the gallery was completely silent, but their body language spoke volumes. People were sitting straighter in their seats, many nodding almost unconsciously as her words resonated with their own experiences. The reporters had stopped taking notes and were simply watching, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. "So yes, Congressman Schiff, I am young. Yes, I haven't spent decades in these halls, but I've spent my entire life in the real world, dealing with real problems, making real sacrifices. And that, sir, is exactly the kind of experience that Washington needs more of, not less." The final words of her response landed with the force of a gavel. She had taken everything he had used to attack her: her age, her relative inexperience, in politics her outsider status, and turned them into her greatest qualifications for the job. The silence that followed was different from the one that had come before. This wasn't the uncomfortable quiet of anticipation. This was the stunned silence that comes when everyone in a room realizes they've just witnessed something that will be talked about for years to come. Schiff looked like a man who had just been completely outmaneuvered by someone he had underestimated. His mouth opened slightly as if he was going to respond, but no words came out. For perhaps the first time in his long political career, he was at a complete loss for words. The camera operators were frantically adjusting their equipment to capture every angle of this historic moment. The producers in the control rooms were already planning how to package this exchange for the evening news. Political commentators across the country were rewriting their analysis pieces in real time. But the most powerful reaction was happening in living rooms, offices, and coffee shops across America, where ordinary people were watching someone who understood their struggles stand up and speak their truth to power. Phone calls were being made, text messages were flying, and social media was exploding with people sharing the moment with friends and family. In that single, perfectly crafted response, Karoline Leavitt had done something that political consultants spend millions of dollars trying to achieve. She had connected with the American people on a level that transcended party politics and spoke directly to their shared human experiences. The game had changed completely, and everyone in that room knew it. What had started as an attempt to diminish her had instead become the moment that defined her as a new kind of political leader, one who drew her strength not from years of political maneuvering, but from years of real-life experience that millions of Americans could relate to and respect. The aftermath of those words was like watching ripples spread across a still pond, except these ripples were moving at the speed of light through fiber optic cables and cellular towers, reaching every corner of the country within minutes. What had just happened in that hearing room was already being shared, discussed, and debated by millions of people who had never heard Karoline Leavitt's name an hour earlier. The first sign that something extraordinary had occurred came from the social media analytics teams at major news networks. The numbers were unlike anything they had seen for a routine congressional hearing. Views were climbing by hundreds of thousands every minute. The hashtag that had been created for the hearing was trending nationally within 15 minutes and internationally within 30. In the hearing room itself, the atmosphere had completely transformed. The confident smirk that had played across Schiff's face for most of the morning was gone, replaced by the stunned expression of someone who had just been completely outmaneuvered by an opponent they had underestimated. He shuffled his papers, aimlessly, clearly struggling to figure out how to respond to what had just happened. The committee chairman, sensing that the normal flow of the hearing had been disrupted beyond repair, called for a brief recess. As the participants began to file out of the room, the buzz of conversation was immediate and intense. Reporters were already on their phones with their editors, trying to convey the significance of what they had just witnessed. "You had to be there to understand it," one veteran political journalist was saying into his phone. The video won't capture the feeling in that room when she said those words. It was like watching someone's entire political career change in real time. Meanwhile, the clip was already being edited and packaged by news organizations around the world. The exchange would be played in full on every major network's evening news broadcast, but it was the shorter clips, the most powerful moments condensed into shareable segments, that were really driving the conversation. Within an hour, the video had been viewed over 1 million times across various platforms. By the end of the day, that number would climb to over 10 million. By the end of the week, it would be approaching 50 million views, making it one of the most watched political moments of the year. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real impact was happening in coffee shops and break rooms at dinner tables and in text message conversations between friends and family members. People who rarely paid attention to politics were sharing the video with comments like, "You have to watch this," and "This is exactly what we need more of in Washington." The response from political commentators was swift and varied. Some tried to downplay the significance of the exchange, calling it political theater or suggesting that emotional appeals weren't a substitute for policy expertise. But these voices were quickly drowned out by a chorus of analysts who recognized that something fundamental had shifted. "What we witnessed today wasn't just a political comeback," explained one respected political scientist during a hastily arranged television appearance. "It was a perfect example of how authenticity and genuine life experience can be more powerful than decades of political training." She didn't just defend herself, she redefined what we should be looking for in our elected officials. The calls started pouring into Leavitt's office within hours. Some were from reporters requesting interviews, others from political organizations wanting to offer support, and many from ordinary citizens who simply wanted to say thank you for speaking words they had been waiting to hear from someone in Washington. Her small staff was overwhelmed by the response. The phone system crashed twice from the volume of calls. Her official social media accounts gained hundreds of thousands of new followers in a single day. Campaign contribution websites that had been quietly collecting modest donations suddenly saw a surge of small-dollar contributions from people across the country. But perhaps the most telling response came from other politicians. Within hours, representatives from both parties were issuing statements either supporting her comments or trying to distance themselves from Schiff's approach. The smart ones recognized which way the wind was blowing and wanted to align themselves with the message that was clearly resonating with voters. The impact on Schiff was immediate and severe. His own social media accounts were flooded with comments from people who had watched the exchange. Many were critical, but even more were simply disappointed. "I expected better from you," was a common refrain. You proved her point about Washington, politicians being out of touch. His staff quickly arranged damage control interviews, but the narrative had already been set. Every question he faced in the following days somehow circled back to that moment in the hearing room. When asked about his approach to the questioning, his answers sounded defensive and out of touch, exactly the opposite of the image he had tried to cultivate over his career. The broader political implications became clear within days. Polling. Data showed that the exchange had resonated strongly with voters across party lines. Independent voters in particular responded positively to Leavitt's message about bringing real-world experience to Washington. Even some voters from the opposing party admitted that her words had made them think differently about what they wanted from their elected officials. Campaign strategists around the country were already studying the exchange, trying to understand how a single moment could have such a profound impact on public perception. The consensus was clear. Authenticity had won the day. In an era when voters were increasingly skeptical of polished political messages, someone who spoke from genuine experience had cut through the noise in a way that surprised everyone. The ripple effects continued for weeks. Other young politicians began incorporating similar themes into their own speeches and campaign messages. The idea that real-world experience could be more valuable than years in Washington became a rallying cry for candidates across the country who were running as outsiders. Editorial boards at major newspapers wrote lengthy pieces analyzing the exchange and what it meant for American politics. Some argued that it represented a generational shift in how political discourse should work. Others suggested that it was a one-time moment that would be forgotten by the next news cycle. They were wrong about it being forgotten. Months later, the video was still being shared regularly on social media. Political science professors were using it as a case study in their classes. Leadership training programs were incorporating it as an example of how to turn a difficult situation into an opportunity. But the most lasting impact was on the people who had watched it happen. For many Americans who had felt disconnected from the political process, seeing someone who understood their struggles speak truth to power in such a direct and powerful way was inspiring. It reminded them that their voices mattered, and that the people they elected should understand their lives, not just their votes. The hearing had been intended as a routine political proceeding that would be forgotten by the evening news cycle. Instead, it became a defining moment that showed how a single sentence delivered with conviction and authenticity could change everything. It proved that in politics, just like in life, the most powerful moments often come not from what we expect, but from what we never saw coming.